Okay, well, welcome to those who have joined so far and to those that are still coming in. As Julia mentioned, my name is Melissa Bruntlett, and I've been a Women Mobilize Women ambassador for a couple of years now. Very privileged to be working with this wonderful team focused on how we can build the inclusion of women into our conversations around mobility, and also help build a stronger network of women internationally working in the transport sector. For this series, what we've done is recognize that the intersection of identities and experiences really produces different perspectives of mobility for different people. So as a result, a gender-sensitive mobility transition is about more than one's preferred gender. It's also impacted by age, ability, economic access, geographic location, amongst a myriad of other intersectionalities. And so this webinar series we've used to dive into some of those topics surrounding the intersectionality of gender and mobility, and features prominent voices in the mobility sector. Understanding these differences is an important step to creating an equitable and gender responsive mobility system. And so through these discussions with global advocates, professionals, and leaders, we'll explore these differences and expand not only our own perceptions, but also that of the broader mobility sector. This episode that you're about to watch is a wonderful conversation between myself, Anna Zivarts, and Dr. Kay Inckle about the intersectionality of mobility and disability. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to showing our conversation. I believe our speakers were not able to join us today, but if you have questions, please do put them in the chat. We will do our best to answer them or else pass them on to our speakers to address at a later time. Enjoy. On the intersectionality of gender and mobility. My name is Melissa Bruntlett, and I'm a Women Mobilize Women ambassador and a mobility advocate and advisor. And I'm really pleased to be part of this webinar series because the intersection of identities and experiences produces really different perspectives of mobility for different people. And as a result, a gender-sensitive mobility transition is about more than one's identified gender. It's also impacted by age, ability, economics, access, and geographic location, among a myriad of other externalities. So in this Women Mobilize Women webinar series, we dive into topics that surround the intersectionality of gender and mobility over a series of 30-minute episodes. In this episode, we're going to discuss gender, mobility, and disability, examining the intersection of varied experiences. Exploring mobility, even with a gendered lens, tends to assume that the user is someone who does not experience any physical or neurodiverse limitations to the use and experience of mobility. And however, mobility and access to it impacts everyone, regardless of ability. Quality walking, cycling, and public transport access are integral to participation in society for disabled people. And so today I'm really pleased to be joined by Dr. Kay Inckle, campaign policy manager for Wheels for Wellbeing. Let me say that again, campaign and policy manager for Wheels for Wellbeing, and Anna Zivarts, a low vision mother and non-driver, and author of the forthcoming book, When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency, which is coming in May of this year, in 2024. We're going to discuss the mobility experiences of disabled people to better understand the barriers and how best to address them. And if you want to read their full bios, you can do that in the episode descriptions. So Kay and Anna, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome. And to start out with, why don't we get each of you to tell us a bit about the work that you do? And I'll start with you, Kay.
Hi, thanks very much. So I'm, as has already been said, Kay Inckle, and I'm Campaigns and Policy Manager for Wheels for Wellbeing. We are a disabled people cycling organisation, so that means we are run by and for disabled people. And there's two aspects to the work that we do. One aspect of it is based purely in South London in England, and we have a number of cycle centres there where disabled people can go and try out every kind of cycle you can imagine, and probably other ones that you can't imagine as well, in a safe, disability positive environment, learn to cycle. And then if they want to progress, we have led rides that take people out into the city, and we're also developing a hire scheme where people can borrow one of our cycles for a long-term basis so they can cycle independently. So that's one aspect of the work that we do. And then the other aspect is where my role sits, and that's around campaigns and policy work. So we really advocate and push for not just cycling, but also active travel and multimodal journeys to be fully accessible for disabled people. And in this aspect of our work, we work for nationwide across the UK and also internationally when we're asked to. And we really want more to see cycling and active travel to be an easy, accessible choice for disabled people in just the same way it is for non-disabled people. And all of the work we do, we like to think of using an ethos of mobility justice. And mobility justice is about demanding that instead of more and more transport resources being provided for those who already have the most choice and who are most well served, it's about taking an equitable approach, which is about really providing for those who have least option, least mobility, and really overcoming that inequality with the new provision that we offer. So it's really about overcoming inequalities and making everybody have the same level of choice and freedom when they move around.
And Anna, in your work, it's in a similar field, and I know that you've been inspired a little bit by Kay as well in some of her research. So what are you doing over in Seattle?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's bright and early here in Seattle. So as the sun comes up, you'll see as we're talking. So my name is Anna Zivarts. I work for Disability Rights Washington, and I run a program there called the Disability Mobility Initiative. And I have to say, I had followed Wheels for Wellbeing on social media and was so excited to see their work because when I was working for Disability Rights Washington, originally I was hired to lead the video team to make advocacy videos. And that work was awesome. And we started making a lot of videos about transportation access because as we got to know folks who couldn't drive, couldn't afford to drive throughout our state, we realized that access to mobility, access to where we needed to go was a major barrier and a major concern for folks. And so I started to look for who else was doing this kind of work with mobility and disability in the US and throughout the world, and really Wheels for Wellbeing was one of those places that I looked to say, yes, there are people doing this work and it can be done. And so with that, I got to launch the Disability Mobility Initiative at Disability Rights Washington back in 2020. And we're mostly an organizing program. We work to identify folks and connect with folks throughout the state who can't drive, can't afford to drive, and document their stories, hear about their concerns, hear about what they would like to see changed to make our state more accessible. And this work for me is awesome to be able to do because I grew up here in the state in a community out in the woods without a lot of transportation options. And because I can't drive because of my disability, it felt really isolating, and I didn't think anybody else was in that same position. This was before social media, all of that. And so being able to do this organizing work now and connect with so many other people who feel the same way because they have been isolated, and show that they're not alone, show that there actually are so many of us for whom driving doesn't work particularly well, and that we can start to push together to change our communities so they work better for us.
So just building on that, Anna, I mean, the isolation obviously is a big part of feeling connected to community, but what are some of the other typical barriers that you hear about in the people that you meet in terms of, that access to transport that disabled people really feel on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with, we've designed our communities, especially here in the US, around cars. And so to lead a life where you're connected easily to places you want to go, you basically need to be able to drive yourself. And if you can't, it gets really difficult. And so, I think that's the root of it. And to start to address that, there's, we can start to provide better transit. We can start to connect our communities better with pedestrian and multimodal use, paths, sidewalks, bike paths, and we can start to make sure that we have housing and activities, grocery stores, healthcare, schools close to where we live, which in the U.S. is a major barrier because we're so sprawly and low density, and so that I think is sort of the root of so much of our trouble here. So those are the things we're working on.
And Kay, what would you add to that in terms of your experiences so far?
Yeah, I think particularly in terms of cycling and active travel, I think one of the biggest barriers for disabled people is, to begin with, it's the assumption that disabled people can't cycle. So there's this idea that either you're disabled or you're active. And so much of the infrastructure that we have, so much of the schemes that encourage cycling and active travel completely exclude disabled people. So this perception that, and it's also such a false perception. So the research that we do, we find that for so many disabled people, cycling is actually easier than walking. And that's very often on a two-wheel bicycle, just a standard bicycle. And again, there is this complete disbelief that you can be disabled and cycle a bicycle. I think if you're cycling a non-standard cycle, so for example, if you're using something like a tandem because you're visually impaired or neurodivergent or learning disabled, there is a little more recognition. Or if you're using a tricycle or a hand cycle, which is something I use, people can see that, but then they think you're an anomaly, and they think that you're an anomaly as a disabled person doing that, rather than actually disabled people are facing so many barriers to cycling. So, you know, if you need a non-standard cycle in the UK, they cost thousands and thousands of pounds. I mean, anything from £4,000 to £12,000, which, given that disabled people tend to earn less money than non-disabled people, it's kind of like a double barrier. What you need is more expensive and you have less disposable income. But at the same time, as Anna has already pointed out, because so much transport is inaccessible if you're in a car dependent environment and you can't drive. And again, in the UK, so much public transport is inaccessible. So buses, trains, trams, very unreliable levels of accessibility for disabled people, but also even pavements. I mean, most of the pavements in the UK, they're not flat, they don't have any tactile demarcation, there's no cut curbs, they're cluttered with bollards and 80 frames and all kinds of business advertising. That it's actually, if you can cycle, it's very often the only reliable autonomous way you can get from A to B, and just depend on yourself. Know you're going to get there. Nobody else is involved in making decisions or preventing that by, for example, not putting a ramp down or not letting you bring an assistance animal if you use one. So yeah, it can be absolutely life-changing for people in terms of that autonomous mobility, and yet there's all these perceptual and other barriers that make it so difficult for disabled people to access that. And then of course it has the benefits of it's sustainable, it's health promoting, it's all those other things that you really want. So yeah, it can be revolutionary, but it feels like we've yet to get the wider world to recognise that disabled people can cycle and just need some of these barriers removed so that disabled people have equitable access to cycling.
Yeah, I want to jump off that, and I think, Kay, what you're sharing is so important for people to understand that disabled people do bike already and want to, because there is this assumption that, you know, that's not possible. Back in 2020, I had the opportunity to make a video. NACTO hired us to make a video about disabled bikers, and we just put out a call on social media for stories, and we got so many people sending us video clips. And for me, it was great, because I also I'm able to bike, even though I can't drive, but I was very hidden in biking spaces about my disability, because I worried, you know, that I wouldn't be seen as safe or, you know, accepted. And it was really it was great to see that there are so many people who bike, and I've through this work gotten to know quite a few people who bike with the eye condition I have, because we can't get driver's licenses. And one of those people I talk about in my book, and she's just someone who I love. She's older than me and has raised a couple of kids there in college now. And she grew up in the suburbs, or she raised them in the suburbs in Arizona. So not a very friendly place to, you know, to be without being able to drive. And she, for years and years, used a golf cart to get her kids around, because that was sort of the mobility that worked for her. And with the sort of affordability and boom of e-bikes that we've seen, now she uses an e-bike, which I think is so exciting. I think there's so much potential with these cheaper batteries and new technologies. I myself have an e-bike to carry my kid around on. It's great. There's no way I could do the hills here in Seattle without it. And so, yeah, I think that piece is really exciting, but there's a lot of pieces that are still missing. Like, how do we store these? They're very expensive. First of all, are there secure places to store them in your home, in the public? If you want to get on a train, or a bus, can you leave it somewhere secure? All those pieces, as well as, for folks who are using power chairs, electric wheelchairs, a lot of that technology, that explosion of more affordable battery powers and, the ability to go long distances and not worry about, range anxiety, like that hasn't translated over to power chairs because of the way they're paid for through health insurance. And so I hope that we can expand who this e-bike revolution serves, and think more broadly about micromobility in an inclusive way.
Yeah, and that's absolutely something that we're so keen to really use as an opportunity to change perceptions. In the UK, we're starting to have trials of e-scooters and e-bikes on a public share basis. And we're really pushing for a broader range of cycles and e-scooters to be available. So, for example, for e-scooters with more than 2 wheels, with a seat, with luggage or person carrying capacity to broaden who can use it. Same with e-cycles, not just an e-bike, but what about an e-tricycle, upright and recumbent, hand cycle, 2-person cycles, and so on. And yeah, because there is always this sort of binary division between there's transport and all this really cool stuff for non-disabled people, and then there's what disabled people get, which is ugly and rubbish, and nobody really wants to use it. And also, as Anna has said, like the regulations around the quality of it are so much lower. So in the UK, mobility scooters and power chairs that are used by disabled people for their essential mobility, so will need to be outside, are actually not waterproof. So they're not advised to go out in anything other than the very light shower in it. Whereas e-bikes are amazingly waterproof, and you could cycle through a tsunami in it and it'd still be watertight. So yeah, we want to see getting away from disabled people have something else, and all this cool new stuff be designed with the whole spectrum of the population involved in it. And I think when we start making stuff accessible for disabled people, we make it accessible for everybody, for older people, for temporarily injured people, for pregnant people, for people with kids, for people who are riding to up, all of those kind of things, rather than, we get this design that is just actually, when you think about it, for a really small minority of the people who are young, completely non-disabled, traveling on their own, completely fit and healthy, no health condition or disability. And it's like, even if people are like that for a moment in their life, that's not going to be the whole of their life. And I'm always amazed in the sort of active travel space that, it is still predominantly in the UK made up of professionals who are non-disabled, white, cis-het men. And it's like, just the inability to see they are not the majority of the population, and that they are also designing their future self out of transport, because chances are, as they age, or even if they have kids, they are going to have cognitive, sensory, physical impairments. And they seem to be assuming that then they will just not want to move around, not want to go out, not want to be fit, not want to be environmentally friendly, not want to go to green spaces. And I just find that incredible that it's like even their future self they are excluding from what they're doing. So yeah, I think really bringing fully accessible design at the beginning, it makes it accessible for everybody throughout the life course. And that's really what we want if we want people to transition to healthy and sustainable forms of transport. It's got to work for the majority of the population for the majority of your life. And otherwise it's not public transport, it's niche transport.
Yeah. So I'm happy to just listen. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. No. I just, like, something Kay said really made me, I think this is so true that, we get these mobility devices designed for And you know, Washington State, what we consider it, we call them as the tech bros, right? Because they have all the money, you know, they're the people that the venture capitalists who are funding a lot of these you know, things they're their target audience. And you know, I think the same is true for our transportation system and transportation advocacy in general. When you go into spaces where, you know, there are people trying to think about, okay, how do we improve transit? How do we make our communities, you know, more livable? How do we, you know, all of these places tend to be dominated by the same voices, because the rest of us, you know, it will take us 2 hours to get to that public meeting using the bus, or, you know, we have caregiving responsibilities, or we need a caregiver, right? Like these things make it harder to participate in the systems that we've set up for participation. And it's interesting because in Washington State, we got a study funded here through our state legislature that looked at non-drivers broadly and found that, yes, non-drivers are 30% of the population. And 17% of non-drivers are non-drivers by choice. And those non-drivers by choice tend to be male, they tend to be wealthier, they tend to be younger, and they're able-bodied. And you know, it's those voices that tend to dominate so many of these spaces. And then it's their needs that get centered when we're designing mobility systems or thinking about zoning or housing, and that doesn't create systems that work well for the rest of us. And so we really need to think about how we include and center and listen to the voices that aren't in those rooms already.
Yeah.
So then my question for both of you, you know, building on that would be, you know, you've talked a little bit about what we can do or what we should be thinking about, but you know, for both of you, how do you think that we can develop a more inclusive approach to design, to the access to different types of mobility devices, to public transport? What do you think can be more inclusive in how we go about this? And I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, I talk about recommendations in my book, and but you know, like things that people have told us they would like to see change, right? And I think those are really all important. And it's important for people who are planners or engineers or elected officials or, you know, running advocacy organizations to listen to that. But at the end of the day, I think what is most important is to, you know, invite in and include and change systems so that these people who have historically not had a seat at the table get a seat at the table. And not like the little kids table either, you know, actually being at the big kids table where the real decisions are made in that room, right? We need to have people with the lived experiences that are most impacted when these transportation systems don't work for us. And so that's really the heart of the work I'm doing now, pushing for how do we change that power structure a little bit to have different voices included. And, you know, it's not easy work. I think we get a lot of pushback even from folks who would be considered our allies, because we're asking people to give up some amount of authority that they have currently and share it with other people who haven't. And that is perceived as threatening. But ultimately, I think that's how we get to change, because there's no way, you know, my recommendations, you know, from listening to everyone and, you know, sharing those in a book, that's not going to change things. What's going to change things is having different people be in rooms all across the world who haven't been there before and fighting for what they need.
Yeah, I'd agree, absolutely. I mean, I think it's fundamental that the transport profession itself change and looks like the population, which it certainly doesn't at the moment. And I think there's a big onus on the transport profession. And, you know, in the UK, there's lots of sort of big consultancy agencies and transport planners. And I really feel like the onus is on them is to actually start providing training and recruitment and apprenticeships well paid for people who are underrepresented and particularly disabled people in that. And while those people are coming through, I think there needs to be also a real emphasis on co-production. So nothing should be designed without the input from disabled people's organisations, disabled people individually, a real clear understanding of co-production and ensuring that all transport design is co-produced, and again paying people adequately for their time, because again in the UK disabled people and disabled people's organisations constantly get consulted and asked to provide input, usually for free, our time is not reimbursed, and then people go ahead and do what they wanted to do anyway. So there's also a level of consultation fatigue amongst disabled people. We've been saying for decades what is wrong with transport, and still we are getting the same really poor quality design. So if you look at, for example, most buses and trains in the UK, only one disabled person can travel at one time. So only one wheelchair or one assistance dog is permitted at the same time. There's a real limitation about what types of mobility aids can be on board. Disabled people often have to pre-book to use trains. There's no level access. I mean, still in many train stations, there's not even tactile paving to demarcate the edge of the pavement. So blind and visually impaired people have been seriously injured and killed because there's simply nothing to indicate they've reached the platform edge. So, I mean, there's all this stuff that disabled people have been saying, and it's not taken on board. So I think a real emphasis on this expertise is valuable, pay for it and implement it. And I would also like to see really strong detriments for transport organisations and providers who aren't doing really high standards of accessibility. So often there's an excuse of like, oh, it's too difficult, or it's too expensive, or this is a historic building, and it's like, sorry, that's not good enough. We can fly things to Mars, you know, we can land things on satellites, we can do accessible transport on Earth, and really that should absolutely be our priority. So I think absolutely just mandating that disabled people need to be involved, need to be represented, and then the input that disabled people have has to be taken on board. And there must be penalties when that is not taken on board and when there are fails. I think, you know, there's often a real inequality between the severity with which discrimination against another minority group would be perceived as, certainly in the UK, compared to disabled people. So it wouldn't be acceptable, for example, to have, for example, only one lesbian on the bus, but somehow only one disabled person on the bus is okay. And it's like, under our equality legislation, these are all equally protected identities, and yet the standard for disabled people seems to be so much lower. So yeah, I think we really need to really re-emphasize that disabled people are a significant part of the community and have the same human rights as everybody else, and it's about time that they were fully implemented.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we're trying here in some of the work we've done in Washington State and starting to do that more nationally in different parts of the country is talking about, you know, because disabled people are a relatively, not a tiny part of the population, but not as big as everyone who can't drive, right? And so we are trying to figure out how can we build an even bigger coalition so we have more political power, right? Because when we're just talking about, you know, low vision folks, there's not really that many of us out there in the universe. We exist and our need to be met. But, you know, we have disability law here in the US, and, you know, that's not getting us there. It's not getting, we might be illegal to, you know, have that, you know, whatever inaccessible crossing signal, but the money to fix it isn't there. And so how do we build the kind of coalition that would change our priorities, our budget priorities, so that we can get those accessible signals installed, so we can get more reliable transit, so we can get better infrastructure for us. And so that's sort of the focus of my work right now is building that coalition. Let's get, you know, disabled folks plus other folks who can't afford to drive because driving is so expensive. Young folks who are too young to drive, seniors who are aging out of driving, immigrants who have come to this country and don't have driver's licenses. Like, you know, we could all together push for a change in the way our communities work. And then there's also folks who are choosing not to drive, right, for environmental reasons and other reasons, and they can be part of that coalition too. But really, you know, how can we build a bigger tent so that we can be more visible and you know, instead of spending these billions on highway expansions, that is what our, you know, country currently has done for a long time and continues to do. Those billions could be invested in making our communities more accessible without cars.
And as you pointed out at the beginning, Kay, like once you start looking at it from that perspective of a disabled person or a child or a senior, you then are actually designing for everybody. And it's not exclusionary, it's actually very inclusive, because you are thinking of, yeah, that person that might be temporarily impaired, or, you know, when we get older, our vision might deteriorate over time. You know, all of these things that happen to us throughout our lifetimes. And yeah, just designing for that one stage of someone's life where they might be completely non-disabled, completely visually clear, 20/20 vision, you know, all of those kinds of things is really, yeah, myopic in a lot of ways of not seeing the real intersectionality again of how we all live our daily lives.
Yeah, and I think just in terms of sort of building those coalitions, I guess there's sort of three things that I'd sort of, think about in terms of our work around that. So in the UK, the law which defines what counts as a disabled person is pretty broad. So under the legal definition, about 20% of the UK population is disabled, which is a fifth. So that's a lot. But then, of course, that's a huge spectrum of different experiences. That's everything from cancer to being learning disabled, to being a wheelchair user, to being blind or vision impaired. So huge range of experiences in there, and sometimes it can feel like within that large group of people there are conflicting needs. So as a cycling organisation, one thing that we sometimes get some pushback from is other disabled people's organisations who feel that we are part of a cycling lobby that is trying to take people's cars off them if they do need a car, or that we are wanting to do things that make the pedestrian realm unsafe for older people or blind and visually impaired people. So as a cycling organisation, we're quite niche and have to sort of do coalition building amongst the spectrum of disabled people. And then also beyond that as well, so something that we're also working on at the moment is working with different women's groups around the shared experiences, particularly around, for example, social safety, that women, and particularly women from minoritized groups, are going to experience. So something about being hyper visible as, for example, a woman of colour wearing a hijab, cycling a bike, that often results in quite a lot of public harassment or attention, in a similar way to being a visibly disabled woman cycling. And it's that combination of being visible, being female, being subject to harassment, and then also that then translates into thinking about, okay, so what kind of cycle infrastructure is okay? Going through an unlit park is not okay. Having cycle storage that's in a dark basement is really not going to work. So there's all these sort of broader aspects of accessibility and safety that we share with other groups as well. So I think working across that spectrum is really important. And then the other coalition that we have that's been active for a while is what we call the Beyond the Bicycle Coalition. And that is really around the shared experiences of disabled people, particularly those using non-standard cycles, and then people with family cycles and people with cargo cycles, particularly using them for logistics and deliveries and so on. And again, the whole issue of infrastructure that is just designed for, you know, the non-disabled person on a lightweight two-wheel bicycle that can whip through things, that can lift up steps and all of those kind of things. So again, looking at another group of people who are experiencing similar barriers, and again, how we can work together to raise those issues. So I think, yeah, identifying those shared experiences is so important. And again, it really emphasizes this isn't a minority issue. This is really something for most people at some point in their lives.
I'll give you the final word, Anna, if you want to add anything to that, and then we'll close out.
Sure. Yeah, no, just something Kay said around, I was thinking about the bike parking at my office is in this awful dark parking garage that I call the rapey parking garage, and I refuse to use it because, yeah, I think there really is, you know, gender and racialized experiences that people have when you are outside of sort of that protective cocoon of a private vehicle, and we have to really be willing to talk about those because it's not always easy, and it really does, you know, I was at a conference yesterday and someone came up to me after my talk and shared with me some of her experiences on public transit, right? And those can be really, really challenging and really a big deterrent for people who face harassment, right? And so I think that social piece is something that's so important. And yeah, and biking particularly, just even if it's encouragement from other people in public, it is really grating, and to constantly be that sort of that visible, what you talked about, Kay. So yeah, I think that's such a critical piece.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you both have brought up some amazing points that are certainly something that everyone should be thinking about, whether they're a professional working in this field or an advocate or just someone who's watching out of interest and wants to think about how they can help support, or maybe someone who has a shared experience with what you all have discussed today. I think it's important that we keep having these conversations. And I do just want to say that I appreciate both of you coming and sharing those experiences with us, because I do recognize that your time, everyone's time is valuable, you know, to be asked these similar questions, share these similar ideas. I know a lot of communications is about repeating the same message over and over again. So thank you for doing that and helping to bring the conversation, keep moving it forward. And I do hope that a lot of those of us who participate in this conversation can take these ideas and really push, whether that's in our organizations that we work for, in the communities where we live, to really think beyond just seeing the disability, but actually understanding it and thinking about how we can integrate it better in a more socially inclusive aspect of our city. So thank you both. If anyone wants to find you and ask more questions after this, how can they find you?
So we're online. We're wheelsforwellbeing.org.uk. My email is kay@wheelsforwellbeing.org.uk, and we're also on formerly Twitter X @wheels4well. But yeah, a Google search and you should find everything you need to know about us pretty quickly.
Wonderful.
Awesome. Yeah. So Disability Rights Washington, you can Google us. One of our big campaigns is the Week Without Driving. We just launched a new website for that, so weekwithoutdriving.org. And you can find me on social media if you just look up Anna Zivarts. I'm on a bunch of different platforms now, trying to figure out what is the future. So yeah, look forward to connecting.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining. Thank you to those who are watching, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Anna Zivarts is here. She's been answering some messages on the chat. So if you have a question for her, please do either raise your hand if you'd like to do it yourself, or stick it in the chat. Anna, do you mind turning your camera on so we can see you? There you are.
Hi.
Hi. Just out of pure joy, Anna shared a wonderful photo on her LinkedIn this week of the unboxing of her new book. So that was quite exciting. And I guess my question for you, Anna, is, you know, I would like to know from your standpoint why, what compelled you to write the book, and you know, what do you hope people gain from it, or maybe one of the things of the many that you hope people gain from reading the book is.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we've done such wonderful organizing work in Washington State, really collecting these stories from people who, I think, at least for me growing up as someone who couldn't drive, I didn't know other adults who didn't drive. I didn't know there were other people out there in the universe. And so that sort of visibility was really a big piece of why I wrote this book. I wanted people to feel seen, that they weren't alone in not driving. And I wanted people who do have the ability to drive to recognize that there are many people who can't afford to, or who can't do it physically, or who are aging out of it, or don't know how to, or are too young, and that we can imagine a different future that doesn't require this kind of car dependence, especially if we listen to the folks who have already figured out ways to make their lives work without driving. So that's the work. You know, I have lived in different parts of the US, in New York City, in Arizona, and then in Washington State, where I am now. I would love to include more international perspective. I've actually been getting some questions about, does the book cover other parts of the world? I wish it did, and maybe that's part two, because I think things are different in different parts of the world, but also I think there are many similarities as we sort of bake in car dependence in more communities. So that's it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm scanning and not seeing too many questions at the moment, but oh wait, no, here's one. Thank you, Balin. What would you recommend on engagement when we look to balance the needs of various spectrums of disabilities disabilities and design?
That is such a good question. I think I think I know Glenn from Seattle. If you're the person who I think you are, hello, thanks for coming. Yeah, I mean, this is tricky, right? Because there are competing access needs sometimes, and it can be tricky to figure out. Okay, well, I was thinking of like, even just in accessible spaces and offices, like different people have different temperatures that they prefer. Some people get really cold. Like I'm someone who's always cold all the time. Other people get really hot. How do you find a room temperature that works for everyone? And I think the same is true for our spaces. And so our public spaces. So how do we create as many options as possible that are safe and comfortable, that give people choices? To choose what is most comfortable for them, but also, thinking about prioritizing people who have the less choices, the least choices in these situations, who is most limited by physical ability, by access to resources, and how do we make sure that they aren't being stuck at home and facing isolation or having to depend on others in a way that isn't good for their mental health or physical well-being.
And I know in our conversation, I think just inherently the three of us being people that work in cycling as well, we talked a lot about that. But in your research in the book and in the conversations that you had for NACTO, for example, were you getting a lot of experiences from people who don't cycle but are more what would fall more into the pedestrian space and what those experiences were like?
For sure. And I think, one thing that's really interesting in working in disability spaces around mobility is that there really is like not these strict binaries between disabled and not disabled and like cycling and not cycling. And you start to think about like when I have an e-bike now, and I can talk batteries and different types of battery configurations and challenges with someone who uses a power wheelchair, right? And that many of not that power wheelchairs and bikes are the same, but in some ways they're more similar than, say, a car in a power wheelchair or a bike in a car. And so we have, these range of devices that can help us get around, can make, it possible to go further distances. And I wish we were designing communities that thought more about how to use these smaller mobility devices, whether they're e-mobility or people-powered mobility, but how can we make it easier for people to get around without a multi-ton vehicle, just for sustainability reasons, for human connection reasons, for public health reasons. I think there's a lot more possibility there that we're just starting to explore, and that's sort of, I guess that's the future of transportation that I'm excited about, much more so than futures involving autonomy or large whatever flying helicopters or other things that you hear about in these sort of future of mobility conversations.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I'm mindful of the time, so I think if there are no other questions, Julia has one more question for us, and then we'll wrap up. Julia asks, what would you say are some solutions to reach more people with disabilities in research methods based on public engagement?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it starts with hiring folks with disabilities to be part of your research teams and part of your departments and agencies who are doing the outreach, because I think in my experience in doing the outreach in Washington State, I started with a network of people that I knew, and then I hired many of them to reach out to their networks. And it was sort of through that spiderweb effect that we were able to find a lot of folks who would be willing to share their experiences and stories and be part of our organizing work. And so, those relationships and networks exist in many places, and it's sort of how do you tap into them? And how do you bring in and pay for the expertise of people who are connected into those networks already?
Awesome. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap up there. Like we've said throughout the session, if anyone has further questions for Anna or for Kay, there's ways to reach them. We'll also make sure to include them in the show description notes. and it was included in the chat. So if you missed it, just scroll back on up and you can find them. With that, thank you, Anna, for joining us today, early morning on the west coast of North America. Thank you. And for those that are here, be sure to join us for our next episode, which will be in 2 weeks, where we'll speak to professionals working in the Indian perspective and what that looks like, what mobility looks like from a socioeconomic perspective for them. And other than that, thank you all for joining us. And Julia, did you want to add anything from the Women Mobilized team before we sign off?
Thanks so much, everyone. See you soon for episode 3. Yeah, sorry, that's my note. I do have to add that we have a 3rd episode of this webinar series that's going to happen in 2 weeks. And that is March 21st on gender mobility and socioeconomic status. And you can sign up now on LinkedIn so you don't miss it. And if you missed episode 1, the link to YouTube, the YouTube recording of this episode is also in the chat. And with that, I wish you all a very nice rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.